Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our presentation on SROI. And we're excited to dive into the weeds a little bit on a topic that we would imagine many of you have heard of, and maybe there's still some education that can come to it and some better understanding of how exactly to use it. So the title of today's presentation is From Status Quo to Strategic, How SROI Can Revolutionize Your Giving. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how you can use SROI to shift from just simply proving the impact of your programs to improving them and improving the impact of your program. So let me introduce myself. My name is Gabe Cohen, and I work for True Impact, which is an impact measurement solution that can help you to do both of those things, to both prove and improve your impact. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to let my colleague Sarah introduce herself as well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Ansel. I'm a client success manager here at True Impact, and I work with companies and their nonprofit partners to measure the impact of the company's philanthropic giving. I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin, and I come from a nonprofit background. So as much fun and as nerdy as the measurement work is, I really enjoy thinking about how do we support organizations that are doing really important, good work, and how do we amplify that to funders. So I'm excited to talk about how SROI can be a really important tool in that effort.
That's great. Thanks, Sarah. And I'm going to get into my background in a little bit because it's somewhat relevant to the story that we're going to tell. But for now, let's get into the thick of the presentation. And we want to start by doing the in a world sort of thing where we help to think about why we're talking about this topic today and where can we get as a sector if we get this thing right. And so we want you to imagine a world where you can easily identify high performing nonprofits aligned with your goals. So what this looks like in function is that you as a team decide what your strategy is going to be and where you want to focus, who you want to focus on, and what sort of things you want to accomplish with your philanthropic giving. From there, then it actually becomes much easier to identify the organizations that are doing the most good in those areas, whether it's a cause area, demographic area, or geographic area, because you have that impact information, that detailed impact information. So what can you do or maybe stop doing if you have that information? And one of the things that we thought about was that it gives you the information you need and the intelligence that you need to stop donating to the board chair's alma mater, because you're able to say that that giving is not impactfully aligned with your goals and with your strategy as an overall organization. So that's the kind of mental image that we want to lead off with today. And then let's dive into the theme of our conversation today, or the topic of our conversation today, and that's SROI, or social return on investment. And the easiest way to think about that is the amount of social value that's generated for every $10,000 of philanthropic contribution. So we're going to get into the weeds on this, but that's the most important thing for you to remember as we go through this conversation, is that SROI is the amount of social value generated for every $10,000. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to dive right into the weeds of that SROI conversation, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what happens if we use that information for bad, and then we're going to talk about how to use that information for good. And we'll save time for questions and answers at the end as well. So building on that SROI being the amount of good that comes from every $10,000 invested, the next thing that we want to talk about is the difference between SROI and ROI. Seemingly very, very similar topics. And in fact, CSR programs really do help with both, but the way that you can think about it is SROI is the external social impact that's created with your philanthropy. It's how much good is happening externally. And ROI is how much good is happening internally, how much business value is being created. And like I said, CSR can really help with both of those things. But let's get more into the weeds on that SROI side of things. And like we mentioned earlier, the question that it's answering is how much good is being created for every $10,000 in program cost. You could think of this as kind of the bang for your buck, if you will, or starting to find a way to compare the impact of organizations getting as close to apples as possible. But there's some nuance there that we're going to get into. The most important element of SROI, though, is understanding the impact that an organization is having. And so we want to step back, if you will, and think about what that means. And for that, we're going to think about three different elements that lead to impact, or as we describe it, outcomes. So those three different stepping stones on your way to impact, if you will, are inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And we're going to pause for a second here and talk about the difference between those three. The first is inputs, and that's the resources that are contributing towards a program. So the most prevalent statistic that you'll see that's an input is the amount of money that is going towards a program or a cause area. So we've dedicated $30 million to diversity, equity, and inclusion programs this year. That's an input. Could also be the amount of staff or equipment of office space that a nonprofit program is using as well. The next is output. So directly as a result of those inputs would be the outputs that are then delivered, the goods or services that are delivered. So a lot of times you'll see people reached. That's probably the most prevalent statistic that you'll see. That's an output, but you could also see meals delivered or trainings provided or that sort of thing. So you're reaching a person at that point. But we don't really know how much of that is sinking in, if you will, and starting to make a difference in a person's life. And that starting to make a difference in a person's life is really the outcome. How much good has actually happened? How many people's lives are actually improved as a result of that? And that's what we determine as impact. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about how you measure that impact.
Great, thanks, Gabe. So one of the ways that we work with nonprofit partners is helping them articulate the steps along the way to that impact. So the steps along the way are based on a pretty uniform framework, a logic model framework that we use as scaffolding with all of the nonprofit partners that we engage with. So that scaffolding or framework looks like this. So reach, as Gabe said, that's the stage in which folks are engaged or touched in some way by the program itself. Learn is the stage in which participants or beneficiaries gain skills or knowledge or motivation. Act is the stage in which beneficiaries or participants or people take action. They do something with that learning. And then succeed. Succeed is the ways in which lives are improved. So let me just give you a quick example. Let's take a nutrition education program. Reach would be the stage in which young people, let's say it's for kids, young people are engaged in these really exciting nutrition classes. Learn is the stage in which those kids go on and learn about nutrition, maybe about eating fruits and vegetables. Act is the stage in which kids then are inspired to eat more fruits and vegetables. And succeed is the stage in which, as a result of consuming more fruits and vegetables, their health is improved. So a couple of things about that example. If you notice, what we've done with this framework is constantly nudged folks forward in terms of the end result. Another way to do this is to simply say or ask, and then what? So great, you're having classes for kids. It seems like they're really engaged, and it sounds like you have a lot of great programming, that you plan on presenting to the kids. And then what? Then, if I'm responding to that question, I might say, then the kids are going to learn a lot. Fantastic. And then what? Well, the hope is that by learning, they might actually do something. They might change their behavior in some way. That's fantastic. And then what? Well, ultimately, we're hoping that we're going to improve people's lives, that they're going to be healthier. So constantly asking the and then what will also nudge folks forward. The goal is to disentangle the steps along the way to how lives are improved in order to reduce confusion between those outputs and the outcomes. The last thing I'll say about this framework is it's really flexible. So nonprofit partners can define each stage in their own terms, but also if they look at this model, this framework, and say, that's not what we do, which really isn't all that uncommon. A lot of folks look at this framework and say, this all works nicely in a textbook, but this isn't real life. We distribute food during COVID. We're not looking for people to learn about fruits and vegetables. We're simply trying to make sure that folks have a meal to eat. If that's the case, fantastic. Then you can remove learn and act from your framework and say, simply by engaging folks, by distributing meals, we are improving food security. So the point of this framework isn't to box anyone in. It's to help folks articulate the steps along the way, whether it's 3 steps along the way or 1 step along the way to the ultimate outcome, which is improving people's lives. Gabe, should I take this one? Okay.
Yep, I think this is for you.
Okay, great, thanks. So the way that we then, once we've gotten to this really critical piece of information, which is how many lives are improved, the health improvement or the improved food security, we then have a lot to work with. So we can take the total impact of that program and divide it by those program costs. The result is often a really small number. But then when we multiply it by $10,000, which is a uniform metric that we're using, we can then arrive at this standardized unit, successes per $10,000. So let's put some real numbers to that. If an organization is doing important housing work and they house 250 people, it costs them $1 million to do that. That means for every $10,000, they're able to house 2.5 people. From there, using that standardized metric, that social return on investment, you're then able, theoretically, to order the organizations by their SROI. So among the organizations that your foundation might be supporting, who is most effective at attaining, retaining, or improving housing in this example? You could simply order by SROI to get a good sense of who's most effective. I can't help myself but say, if you hear me say that and your immediate reaction is to cringe because this is lacking really important context, you would be right. So I'm going to turn it back to Gabe to talk a lot about how we need to make this a force for good and not an oversimplification that it can have negative results.
All right, so now let's go to the negative version of in a world where SRI gets into the wrong hands. And for that, I want to tell you a little bit of a story that starts about 10 years ago when I worked for an organization that's called GuideStar. And when I was with GuideStar, I ended up using this next image that you're about to see. And it's one of my favorite images that I've ever used in a presentation. So I want to tell you the story behind that. And that story goes something like this. GuideStar started in about the 1980s, and they were publishing information on other nonprofit organizations in a book originally in the 1980s. They were taking information from the IRS and they were putting it into a book and then eventually into a CD-ROM and then eventually to a website. And one of the pieces of information that they started to publicize was this thing that was known as an overhead ratio, which was pretty simply the amount of money that was going towards administrative or fundraising costs versus the amount that was going to programs, quote unquote. And we started to publicize that information in the 1990s and realized at some point that this information really should not be used. And so we created what we started calling the overhead myth, which was that this was a valuable piece of information to judge the effectiveness of nonprofit organizations. And so I went out on tour all over the country and talked to different groups of nonprofit organizations. And I was the blue crayon. I had to say, I'm sorry, we started this thing and we're out here trying to fix it. And so what we would talk about, and Sarah, if you want to go to the next slide, is we would show all of these different pie charts. And I'm sure you all have seen these before. And it was supposed to be this really simple, magical metric that allowed you to determine which were the highest performing nonprofit organizations, but it isn't. And so I would pretty routinely have someone stand up and say, well, if we can't use overhead ratios, what are we supposed to use? And I would say, we should start using the impact that your organization is having. And that impact is harder to get to sometimes, but it's a much more meaningful statistic. And I think that leads us to SROI today, in that I don't want to have to be the blue crayon again. And so that's why Sarah and I are here today, to tell you that both there is a lot of promise to this idea of social return on an investment, but there could potentially be a lot of peril too. So let's talk about that for a minute with a really, really simple example that we have here. And this example is 5 different programs that are all focused on a similar education outcome. And what we did is just a very, very oversimplification of how much is their SRI for every $10,000 of these 5 different programs. And you can see this one, the supplies program, had the most SRI of 6. So it should just be that simple, right? You stack rank it, and then you invest more in the one with the highest SRI. Well, it's not that simple. And like we said, you need to apply more levels of contextualization to that. So again, let's look at what that could look like on this next slide. The important thing to keep in mind here is that while their outcomes are all the same, their impact level or their success threshold might be dramatically different for the different programs. So the supplies, the impact threshold could just be arming people with the supplies they need to learn better. But if you start to look down at the bottom of this, there's a much higher level of impact for graduation or career development. And that's really changing someone's life. It's helping them graduate from college, or it's helping them get a new job, that are going to make a much higher level of impact on their lives. So in this situation, you might want to look at a program like the graduation program to invest more in. Let's take a quick look at not just this fake example, but a real example from one of our clients, Bank of America. And so we've got these 4 different programs. We calculated the SROI with them, and there's this huge range of 0.1 all the way up to 210. So you might think the 210, again, if you were just looking at the simple numbers of this without the context needed, that the 210 would be where you would want to invest. But the impact level is so low that it's actually program D with a very high impact level or success threshold that you would want to invest in. So let's dive in more and start to talk about the things to avoid in not creating the SRI myth. And so there's 4 things that we want to talk about here. The first is you can't look at SRI without context. We've said it a number of times, and we're going to say it a number of times more. The next is, once you do have those SRIs for different programs, look at the high programs and look at the low programs. There's a lot to learn from them. One of the things that you can learn is that the data quality in some of the high SRIs, it might be a little bit questionable. That they're taking some liberties and guessing how much of an impact they're having, and they don't have enough evidence to use to make those decisions. And so you might want to ignore those organizations. The last is, remember, you're not buying a TV. You can't just simply look at star ratings. Pick the one with the highest star rating and go on. These are living and breathing organizations, and the people that are working at them and the stakeholders that they're helping. And so there's much more that needs to be brought into that decision. So how do we take this information and use it for good? So to start to talk about that, I want to show you a picture of what I think is the most beautiful chair in the world. And this is the Eames chair, designed by Charles and Ray Eames. It costs about $7,000, but I don't think that you can apply an SRI to it because it is so beautiful and so comfortable. And what does this chair have to do with SRI? Well, the creator of this chair, Charles Eames, once said that the details are not the details. The details are the design. And we feel the same way about SRI. The details are not the details. The details are the SRI. So Sarah's now going to talk about what that looks like.
When Gabe and I were talking through this, we agreed that context is so essential to looking at and using SROI as a tool for identifying great nonprofits that are deserving of support. We needed to kind of codify what we mean by context. And so what we want to share with you all today are the key pieces of context that we encourage anyone who's looking at SROI to take into account. First, the what. So just as Gabe has been describing, This is looking carefully at the actual impact that the organization is having. So yes, they might be advancing education, but are they doing that by providing supplies, or are they doing that by providing mentorship that leads to higher graduation rates? So really honing in on the what. I have some clients that look at very specific sustainable development goals and looking at whether or not the nonprofit's impacts align with their priority SDGs. So that's one piece of context to take into account. Another is the who. So who is being impacted? I have a number of clients who say, look, we know we want to support young women of color. How they are impacted matters less to us. If they're gaining employment or improving educational access, all of that is something we want to support, as long as that impact is being felt by young women of color. I have other clients who really focus on the where. So they say, look, we really want to support a particular geographic community or maybe some of our own markets. I have one client, and I'm not making this up, they are very specifically interested in a neighborhood in Detroit. And so they want to support all kinds of beneficiaries through all kinds of different impacts in that particular neighborhood. And then last but not least is the how. So I have some clients that say, we are finding that we care about the what, which is improved food security, let's say. But even more than that, we want to focus on systems change. We want to support nonprofits that are doing good work as it relates to strengthening food bank networks. So yes, we're interested in the what, the food security, but we're also interested in the how. We care a lot about policy change or systems change. I have some clients who say we do deep investment in individuals. We really want to support organizations that are going deep for the long term with a core group of individuals. So almost the opposite of systems change. Our perspective on this isn't that one is better than the other here, but the clients that are really moving the needle in terms of amplifying nonprofits that are doing great work is they're thinking carefully about all of these 4 different contexts and identifying what matters to them most, and then bringing that lens to their comparison of SROIs. So one of the ways that we really want to encourage you all to think about SROIs is using it as a flashlight, not as a hammer. So it's an opportunity to illuminate those beautiful details that Gabe was referring to, so that you better understand the organizations that you're supporting and what their actual impact is on their community. So let's talk a little bit about this in the wild, right? So we can talk about these 4 pieces of context, and I'm sure it looks very neat and tidy on your screen, but what does it really look like in action, right? So one of my clients tested this all out in the wild, and there's been some really, really important learning from it. So one of the ways that they wanted to look at context was they were curious about how strongly or how well the nonprofits defined their impact, and also whether or not that organization was contributing to that impact or generating that impact entirely on their own. This kind of gets to the how and the what. We developed kind of a rubric around the impact tier, as we called it, and defined each of those tiers. So again, just the details matter less here than the overall concept, which is they are contextualizing SROI in their own defined ways, the things that matter most to them, which is the what and the how. When we first rank order by SROI, which makes us cringe here at True Impact, they had a quick rundown of which organizations were most effective in terms of increasing access to post-secondary education. My client, smartly though, applied the how and the what lens to the SROI. And when done in that way, you'll see that the organizations that had the highest SROI weren't always in the highest impact tier. So with that context in place, the how and the what, my client was able to then organize SROI by impact tier. They were then able to see within each tier which organizations are highest performing. So this kind of lens brings so much depth and deep understanding of what these organizations are doing to the table when you're using SROI. So we want to be clear that SROI in and of itself is an incredibly useful tool, but it's a tool that should be used in conjunction with these important pieces of context. So let's talk a little bit about how you can use this contextualized SROI to improve your giving. First, it gives you the ability to compare your organization's impacts with others. So this gives you the chance to look at outliers, either to better understand why the SROI might be so low. So that Bank of America example is an excellent one. It's so low because the work that they're doing is so important and has such meaning to the individuals that they impact. And it also gives you a chance to identify those that have super high SROI, either because they are rock stars and doing an incredible job, or because maybe they're not defining the impact very clearly, or they're using reach instead of impact. So this really, again, that flashlight illustration, I want you to keep that in your mind. It gives you this flashlight to look at these outliers, to kind of gut check whether or not it makes sense to you. Also, the client that is using SROI and specifically looking at the how, the intervention type, it is such a smart way. So what they're seeing is they're able to think about, are there other strategies or interventions that we could support that drive similar impacts, but do it in a much more effective way? So my client in year 1 was just excited to improve food security. In year 3, they are thinking a lot more about systems change and how that impacts so many more millions of lives when it comes to improved food security around the world. This is such a beautiful way to use SROI. So that client that I just described, where they created these impact tiers, they are not only shining a flashlight, they are shining a spotlight on organizations that are doing incredible work. So within the high impact tier, even though the SROI in comparison to some others are lower, they can say these organizations are having a profound impact on the communities in which they operate, and we want others to know about it. They are sharing their impact reports, which they've created with us at True Impact, to other funders in their community, so that these organizations can continue to garner more support. And then lastly, I'm seeing clients recognize that the journey of improving SROI, it goes hand in hand with supporting the organizational capacity. So when they're able to invest in these organizations, build up the strength of staff and the systems within that organization, they are seeing improved SROI over time. And they're using that as a KPI when they're thinking about the efficacy of their donations. So SROI, at the end of the day, is not just an opportunity for kind of stark comparison. It's an opportunity to shine a spotlight. It's an opportunity to test, to check your gut about these outliers. It's an opportunity to think strategically about how to invest over the long haul. Last but not least, it's a great opportunity to validate those models that are proving very, very effective, again, using that spotlight. Gabe, I'll turn it back over to you for those action items.
Yeah, so we really want to leave you with steps that you can immediately take to start to dive into SROI and to use these in your grant making decisions. So we've got 4 different things that you can do. So the first is to track the social impact and full program costs of your supported programs. And I don't think that one's going to shock anybody. Those are really the 2 pieces that you need to have to get to SROI. So how much impact is the organization having, and how much is it costing to get that impact? The next is to gather those contextual details that Sarah just went over, the who, what, where, and how, and make sure that you're working with your nonprofit partners in a way that is helpful in gathering this information and isn't harming them. We'll get back to that one in just a second too. Number 3 is to calculate the SROI and then use that flashlight. Again, keeping that context in mind so that you're not just stack ranking the SROI and going from there. Think about the tiers that Sarah just went over and how you can start to cluster organizations together to then figure out which ones with that flashlight are standing out as potentially strong organizations. And then the last thing, and I touched on this before, is to stop asking nonprofits to report on things that don't matter. You don't need inputs from them. You don't need outputs from them. Think about the things that you do need that are going to help you make actionable decisions, not just the things to ask because you've been asking for them for 20 years, but what are the pieces of information that are going to allow you to take action and to increase funding to an organization or to get them additional support that they need to make more of an impact with your funds. So those are the things that we think that you can do to start to move to a much more strategic sort of philanthropy. With that, we are going to leave you with a simple thank you. Thank you for joining us today for this presentation. And if you do have any questions, our email addresses are right there on the screen for you. We'd love to hear from you. We know that SROI is a complex topic. When we were putting this presentation together, I think both Sarah and I learned some things about it. And so we wouldn't be shocked if you all have questions, and please feel free to reach out.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.